The morning air carried a bite of late autumn as Olivia Carter stepped out of the taxi at Denver International Airport. The city had been quiet when she left her apartment, the streets still wrapped in darkness, but here, the airport was alive with movement. Rolling luggage hummed against the tiled floors, voices echoed through the terminals, and flight announcements crackled over the intercom. Olivia adjusted the grip on her pilot's case and smoothed the front of her uniform, her fingers brushing over the crisp fabric of her jacket. For gold stripes gleamed on each sleeve, catching the overhead lights as she walked. She had earned every one of them. At 39, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a seasoned aviator. Over 15,000 flight hours, military experience, years of commercial aviation, she had lived and breathed the sky. And today, after months of rigorous evaluations and interviews, she was stepping into her new role as a senior captain at Skyway Airlines. It was supposed to be a proud day, a new chapter. But something in her gut told her it wouldn't be that simple. She had learned early on to trust her instincts. Olivia made her way through the sprawling terminal, navigating past hurried passengers and exhausted airport workers. The pre-flight briefing for Flight 342 to Los Angeles was scheduled for 5:30 a.m., which gave her just enough time to grab a cup of coffee before heading to the crew lounge. She spotted the lounge entrance and reached for the door. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it. The shift. Conversations that had been flowing in easy rhythm slowed, then halted altogether. A few pilots glanced her way, their eyes flicking over her uniform before returning to their screens or paperwork. Others kept talking, but with lowered voices, as if she had brought an unfamiliar presence into their space. It wasn't new to her. Olivia had been a woman in a man's world long enough to recognize that pause, that moment of reassessment when people sized her up and decided where she fit, or if she fit at all. She moved toward the coffee station, keeping her expression neutral, but she was aware of the glances trailing her. "You must be Captain Carter," a voice said behind her. She turned to find a man in his early 50s standing a few feet away. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his uniform sharp, for gold stripes matching her own. Captain Matthew Holden. She had read his file, 25 years at Skyway, well respected, but known for being old school in ways that weren't always flattering. "That's me," she said, offering her hand. Holden shook it, but his grip was quick, perfunctory. "Welcome to Skyway," he said, though the words felt more obligatory than warm. "I'll be your check captain for the next few flights." "I appreciate that," Olivia replied. "Looking forward to working with you." Holden gave a curt nod. "Briefings in Room C in 5 minutes." Then he was gone. She watched him walk away, feeling that twist in her stomach again. Something told her that this wasn't going to be just another check flight. 5 minutes later, Olivia stepped into the briefing room. 6 flight attendants were already seated, along with her assigned first officer, Jason Kim. She recognized him from her prep work, a young, sharp pilot with 5 years of experience in commercial aviation. Jason stood as she entered. "Captain Carter," he said with a smile. "I've heard great things. Looking forward to flying with you." Olivia smiled back. "Likewise." Before she could sit, another figure entered the room, tall and imposing. Thomas Barrett, Executive Director of Operations. His presence sent a ripple through the room. "There's been a change of plans," Barrett announced, not bothering with pleasantries. His gaze flicked past Olivia as if she weren't there. "Captain Holden will be taking command of Flight 342 today. Captain Carter, we need you to wait outside while we reassign you." The room went silent. Olivia felt the heat rise in her chest, though she kept her expression even. She was scheduled for this flight. It had been set weeks ago. "May I ask why?" she said, her voice calm. Barrett glanced at Holden, then back at her. "It's a matter of experience," he said smoothly. "Los Angeles can be a challenging approach. Given your unfamiliarity with our protocols." With all due respect, Olivia interrupted, "I've flown into LAX dozens of times, in all conditions. My qualifications were thoroughly reviewed during my hiring process." Barrett's expression hardened. This isn't up for discussion. Please wait outside. She considered pushing further, but something told her it wouldn't matter. Not now. Not yet. Olivia nodded once, set down her flight documents, and walked out. The hallway felt colder than it had moments ago. She leaned against the wall, forcing her breathing to stay steady. 20 years in aviation, and this was how she was treated on day one. Minutes passed before the door opened again. Jason Kim stepped out, his face tight with frustration. "Captain," he said quietly. "For what it's worth, I think this is garbage." Olivia exhaled slowly. "What did they say after I left?" Jason hesitated. "They claimed it was standard procedure for new captains. But..." He glanced down the hall. "I've been here 3 years. I've seen 4 new captains start. None of them got pulled from their first flight." Olivia absorbed that, her jaw tightening. She had suspected as much. "There's more," Jason said, lowering his voice. "They reassigned you to Flight 556 to Seattle. Said it's to help you get used to company procedures. The captain for that flight is Harold Wilson." The name hit like a weight in her stomach. Harold Wilson. Skyway's most senior captain. A man who had openly voiced his opposition to diversity initiatives in the industry. Olivia nodded slowly. "I see." "Captain," Jason said hesitantly. "If you want to file a complaint, I'll back you up." She looked at him, appreciating the offer. But she had been here before. She knew how these things played out. "Let me handle Seattle first," she said. "But thank you." Jason nodded. "Good luck with Wilson," he said. "He can be old-fashioned." Olivia almost laughed at the euphemism. "I've dealt with old-fashioned before," she said. As Jason walked away, Olivia's phone vibrated in her pocket. A text from her younger sister, Michelle. "Knock him dead on your first day, sis. So proud of you." Olivia stared at the message for a moment, emotions warring within her, pride in how far she had come, anger at the situation, and a determination that had been forged over years of facing obstacles like this. She typed back a quick reply. "All good here. Tell you about it tonight." Then she tucked her phone away. Flight 556 to Seattle awaited. A different route. A different plane. The same battle. But Olivia Carter had never been one to back down. The terminal bustled with early morning energy as Olivia Carter made her way through the concourse toward her assigned gate. The overhead lights cast a soft glow on the polished floors, and the distant hum of jet engines vibrated through the massive windows. Outside, the first rays of daylight streaked across the sky, tinting the horizon with a golden hue. Her uniform was crisp, her captain's stripes standing out boldly against the deep navy fabric of her jacket. Passengers barely noticed her as they hurried past, heads down, focused on their own journeys. But Olivia knew the moment she stepped into the crew lounge, she would no longer be just another face in the airport crowd. She had already seen the way people reacted to her presence. The measured glances. The quick shifts in body language. The polite but distant greetings. It wasn't always overt, but it was unmistakable. Skyway Airlines was not a place that had seen many captains like her. Olivia entered the crew lounge and was immediately met with the scent of strong coffee and the low murmur of pilots and flight attendants reviewing flight plans, swapping stories, and checking their schedules. The atmosphere was one of quiet camaraderie, but as she walked further into the room, she felt it again, that subtle change in energy. A few conversations trailed off. A couple of glances were exchanged. A man at one of the tables looked at her, then looked away quickly, as if unsure of what to make of her presence. She had dealt with this before. Olivia moved to the coffee station, pouring herself a cup, taking her time, listening. Years in the cockpit had trained her to observe without appearing to do so. A pilot 2 seats away muttered something under his breath to the man across from him. The second man chuckled, shaking his head. She knew their type. The ones who thought aviation belonged to them. The ones who saw her and immediately looked for ways to dismiss her. The ones who would test her again and again, hoping she'd slip up. "Captain Carter," a voice called from behind. She turned, coffee in hand, to find Matthew Holden standing there, his arms crossed. He nodded toward the door. "Briefing room. Now." She followed him without a word, past flight attendants adjusting their scarves, past younger pilots scrolling through their phones. The room fell into step behind them, the energy shifting once more. She wasn't just another pilot heading to a briefing. She was the pilot everyone was watching. Inside the conference room, Harold Wilson was already seated at the head of the table. Olivia had only met him in passing before today, but his reputation had preceded him. A man in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and an air of quiet authority, Wilson had been at Skyway longer than most of the fleet itself. He was respected, even admired. But not by everyone. She had heard the murmurs. The stories of how he'd never been shy about expressing his views on the way the industry had changed over the years, who deserved to be in the cockpit and who didn't. She took the seat across from him, meeting his eyes as she did. "You'll be shadowing me today," Wilson said flatly. "I was scheduled to captain this flight," Olivia replied, her voice even. "Not anymore," Wilson said, tapping the flight log in front of him. "Senior leadership thought it best if you spend a few more days observing how we do things at Skyway before taking command of your own flight." Olivia nodded slowly, reading between the lines. This was a message. She could have challenged him, demanded an explanation, forced the issue. But she knew how this game was played. She had no intention of letting them see her rattle. "Understood," she said smoothly, setting her coffee down. Wilson studied her for a moment, as if surprised she hadn't argued. "We'll see how well you fit in here, Captain," he said at last. The rest of the briefing proceeded without incident, but the undercurrent was there. The little remarks. The side glances. The unspoken challenge woven into the way Wilson went over the flight plan, explaining things she already knew, as if she were a rookie on her first day. By the time they boarded, Olivia had her mask firmly in place. The jump seat in the cockpit had never felt so small. Wilson ignored her for most of the pre-flight checks, speaking only to his first officer, Peter Lawson. Every now and then, he would say something in a way that made it clear he knew Olivia was listening. "Gotta be careful when you've got inexperience in the cockpit," he muttered at one point, shaking his head as he adjusted the altitude settings. Lawson shot Olivia an apologetic glance, but said nothing. The flight itself was smooth, the kind that required more patience than effort. The air was clear, the jet stream in their favor. Olivia remained silent, observing as instructed, but inside, she was memorizing every detail. Every minor deviation from procedure. Every mistake that Wilson allowed to pass unnoticed. She saw it before it happened. Wilson entered the wrong frequency for approach control. It was subtle, a small miscalculation that could have been corrected easily, but Lawson hesitated, uncertain. "Captain," Olivia said, her voice calm. "Seattle approach is on 128.35, not 124.75. Wilson's shoulders tensed. For a long second, no one spoke. Then, without acknowledging her, Wilson checked the chart and adjusted the setting. "That's correct," he said stiffly. The silence that followed was heavier than before. As they taxied to the gate, Wilson finally addressed her directly. "You've got a sharp eye," he admitted, though his tone was far from complimentary. "Thank you, Captain," she said. "But don't misunderstand," he continued. "One good catch doesn't make you Skyway material. This airline has standards. Traditions." Olivia met his gaze evenly. "With respect, Captain," she said, "traditions evolve. They have to." Wilson's expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes darkened. "Not at Skyway, they don't," he said. The rest of the day passed in a blur of similar encounters. Flight crews who offered polite but distant acknowledgments. Senior staff who barely concealed their disapproval. executives who found reasons to call her into meetings that had nothing to do with her actual duties. She was being tested, pushed, waiting to see if she would break. That evening, alone in her apartment, she sat with a glass of wine and replayed the day in her mind. Her phone vibrated. A message from Jason Kim. "They're watching you." She exhaled slowly, then typed back, "I know." She put the phone down, staring at the city lights outside her window. They wanted her to quit. They wanted her to walk away, to decide this wasn't worth the fight. They didn't know her at all. Olivia Carter had spent her life proving people wrong. She had no intention of stopping now. The cold wind whipped across the tarmac as Olivia Carter made her way toward the maintenance hangar. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the crisp autumn air, a scent that had long since become familiar to her. It was nearing midnight, and most of the airport had settled into the lull between late departures and the first wave of early morning flights. But here, under the floodlights, the heartbeat of Skyway Airlines still pulsed. She had learned long ago that if you wanted the truth, you didn't find it in the boardrooms. You found it here, among the mechanics, the ground crew, the people who knew the planes better than anyone. Marcus Jefferson was waiting for her near the entrance, his dark blue coveralls stained with grease, a streak of something dark running along his forearm. He had been with Skyway for over 2 decades, long enough to know every shortcut, every corner that had been cut, every decision that put profit ahead of safety. "You sure you want to be seen here, Captain?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "If I was worried about that, I wouldn't be here," Olivia said. Marcus exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Well, you got guts, I'll give you that." They stepped inside, the hum of machinery filling the cavernous space. Olivia's boots echoed against the concrete floor as Marcus led her toward the far end, where a Boeing 737 sat with its nose open, exposing the intricate web of wiring and metal beneath the sleek exterior. "This is one of the planes scheduled for an early morning run to Dallas," Marcus said, nodding toward it. "But take a look at this." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a flashlight, and aimed it at a section near the landing gear. Olivia crouched down, squinting at what he was pointing to. A hairline crack. Barely visible, but there. She felt a slow burn start in her chest. "How long has it been like that?" she asked. "Best guess?" "A couple of weeks," Marcus said. "Should have been grounded the moment it was spotted." "And it wasn't?" Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "Management classified it as a non-critical issue. Signed off on it without a full inspection." Olivia stood, hands on her hips. She had seen this kind of thing before, small at first, little decisions made to save time, to avoid delays, to keep flights on schedule. But small things added up. "How many planes are flying like this?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, glancing toward the main door as if weighing the risk of speaking. Then he sighed. "Too many," he admitted. "Ever since they ramped up the schedule, we've been under pressure to clear planes faster. Inspections that used to take 4 hours are now being rushed through in half that time. If we push back, we're told we're not being team players." Olivia felt her jaw tighten. "Who's giving the orders?" "You already know," Marcus said, his eyes dark with meaning. "Thomas Barrett, Executive Director of Operations. The same man who had made it clear on her first day that she wasn't welcome." She exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to stay calm. "I need proof," she said. "Paperwork. Maintenance logs. Anything that shows what's really happening here." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, nodding slowly. "I've been keeping copies," he admitted. "Wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I knew something wasn't right. I'll get them to you." Olivia nodded. "Be careful, Marcus." "You too, Captain," he said. "You're making enemies in high places." She gave him a steady look. "Then they should be worried." Back in the terminal, Olivia took a detour past the operations center. The floor was quiet this time of night, the walls lined with monitors displaying flight paths, weather patterns, and schedules. She spotted Jason Kim, her former first officer, who had been reassigned after their first flight together. He was standing near the coffee machine, rubbing his eyes. "Captain Carter," he said, straightening when he saw her. "Jason," she said. "How's the new assignment?" He sighed. "Same old. They have me flying with Wilson again." She frowned. "How's that going?" Jason hesitated, then lowered his voice. "He's careful when people are watching, but I've seen him dismiss concerns more than once. Had a flight last week where the oil pressure was running high. Maintenance suggested we delay, but Wilson overruled them. We took off anyway." Olivia's stomach twisted. "Did you report it?" Jason let out a breath. "To who?" "Barrett? The same guy who's covering for him?" She hated that he was right. "Listen," Jason continued. "I don't know what you're planning, but if you're digging into this, be careful. You're already a target." Olivia glanced around the room. No one was paying attention to them, but she knew that wouldn't last forever. "Thanks for the warning," she said. "And if you see anything else, let me know." Jason nodded. "You got it." By the time Olivia returned to her apartment, it was nearly 3 a.m. She set her bag down, exhaling as she pulled out her laptop. She started going through the files Marcus had sent her. Maintenance reports, internal memos, flagged issues that had been downgraded to avoid costly delays. Then she found it. A report from 6 months ago detailing a critical failure in one of Skyway's aircraft engines. The manufacturer had recommended extensive repairs, but instead, the airline had opted for a temporary fix. The plane had continued flying for weeks before a mid-air emergency forced them to address the problem properly. It had been covered up. No formal investigation. No disciplinary action. Just business as usual. Her hands tightened into fists. She had seen enough. She closed the laptop and reached for her phone, scrolling to a number she had saved but hoped she wouldn't have to use. Her sister, Michelle, picked up on the second ring. "Liv? It's the middle of the night. You okay?" Olivia took a deep breath. "I need you to connect me with that friend of yours at the FAA." There was a pause. "You're really doing this," Michelle said. It wasn't a question. "I don't have a choice," Olivia said. Another pause. Then, quietly, "I'll make the call." Olivia stared out the window at the city skyline, the distant lights flickering against the darkness. Skyway Airlines had been built on a foundation of shortcuts and silence. But silence was no longer an option. The early morning air was crisp as Olivia Carter walked through the quiet corridors of Denver International Airport. The terminal was waking up, lights flickering on in concession stands, maintenance crews making their final sweeps before the rush of passengers flooded in. She carried her pilot's case in one hand, her mind already sorting through the growing puzzle of what she had uncovered over the past few days. She had spent years in the aviation world, long enough to know when something was wrong. And something was very wrong at Skyway Airlines. Her first stop was the maintenance hangar. Marcus Jefferson had promised to leave something for her, a folder of documents that would either confirm her suspicions or send her back to square one. She entered through the side door, the smell of oil and metal thick in the air. The hum of distant voices carried through the cavernous space, but no one paid her much attention. Near the back, tucked between an old set of storage lockers, she spotted the envelope. Marcus had folded it neatly and slid it under a maintenance clipboard to keep it hidden in plain sight. She picked it up, her heart beating faster as she flipped through the pages. Inspection logs. Internal memos. A list of flights that had been cleared despite unresolved maintenance issues. And then, at the bottom of the stack, she found something that made her stomach turn. A report from a mechanic who had flagged a serious issue with a Boeing 737's pressurization system. His recommendation had been clear: ground the plane. Instead, the report had been altered, the wording softened, and the aircraft had been approved for flight with a minor delay. The name at the bottom of the revised report? Thomas Barrett. Olivia took a slow breath, closing the folder. This wasn't just carelessness. This was deliberate. She needed to move carefully. As she exited the hangar, her phone vibrated in her pocket. Jason Kim. She answered quickly. What's wrong? I don't have much time, Jason said, his voice low. I overheard Barrett talking to Wilson. They know you've been asking questions. Olivia's pulse quickened. And? They're watching you, he said. You need to be careful. I figured as much. Jason hesitated. Look, I want to help, but you have to be smart about this. They'll come after your record. Your reputation. That's how they work. She exhaled, nodding to herself. I know. Thanks for the heads up. Just be careful, Olivia. She ended the call and tucked her phone away. The game was shifting. She wasn't just an annoyance to Barrett anymore, she was a threat. She needed more than evidence. She needed allies. That night, Olivia met Lauren Kim, a senior flight attendant who had reached out to her after hearing whispers about what she was digging into. They sat in a quiet corner of a cafe near the airport, away from the usual crowd of pilots and airline employees. Lauren set down her tea and leaned in slightly. I don't know everything, she admitted. But I've seen things. Incidents that should have been reported but never made it onto the books. Like what? Olivia asked. Lauren pulled out her phone and scrolled to a set of photos. She turned the screen toward Olivia. The first image was of a damaged cabin pressure valve. The second was of a signed-off inspection report stating the aircraft was safe to fly. This was Flight 336 to Toronto last month, Lauren said quietly. I overheard the maintenance team talking about it before takeoff. They knew it was a problem, but grounding the plane would have delayed 3 more flights. So they covered it up. Olivia stared at the pictures. It was worse than she thought. Why didn't you report this? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Lauren's jaw tightened. Because I like my job. And I've seen what happens to people who make trouble. Olivia nodded, thinking of Marcus, of Jason, of all the others who had whispered warnings her way. And yet, you're here, she said. Lauren met her eyes. Because it's getting worse. And because I don't want to be on a plane that goes down because we look the other way. That hit home. Olivia took a deep breath. I need a copy of those pictures, she said. Lauren hesitated only a moment before nodding. I'll send them tonight. Thank you, Olivia said. Lauren exhaled, rubbing a hand over her forehead. Just promise me something. What's that? If this gets bad, if they come after you, don't take them on alone. Olivia thought about that as she walked back to her car. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Over the next few days, Olivia gathered more pieces of the puzzle. Conversations with ground crew members who were too scared to speak out but hinted at years of unsafe practices. A quiet warning from an anonymous email sent to her airline address, urging her to be careful where you step. She knew she was getting close. Then, late one evening, Marcus called. You need to see something, he said. They met in a parking lot near the employee shuttle stop, the glow of the airport lights stretching long shadows across the pavement. Marcus had his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his face tense. He pulled out a USB drive. Everything I've got, he said. Emails. Reports. Internal memos. It's worse than we thought. Olivia took the drive. What am I looking for? There's a list of incidents that were covered up. But more than that, there's a pattern. Planes that should have been grounded, flights that should never have taken off. They've been doing this for years, Olivia. She clenched the small device in her palm. And nobody stopped them. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. Not yet. She nodded, understanding the weight of what he had just handed her. "I won't let this go," she said. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "That's why I gave it to you." She drove home in silence, her mind racing. Back in her apartment, she plugged in the USB drive and began scrolling through the files. Emails from upper management pressuring mechanics to prioritize efficiency over unnecessary inspections. Internal messages referencing alternative reporting methods to avoid triggering FAA reviews. And then, buried deep in a folder labeled Operations Review, she found a document listing planes with repeated maintenance issues. Some of them were still in service. Some of them had flights scheduled for the morning. Olivia felt her stomach twist. She reached for her phone and dialed Michelle. "Liv," her sister answered groggily. "I need you to connect me with your FAA contact. Now." Michelle sat up, instantly awake. "What's going on?" Olivia stared at the screen in front of her, at the damning proof that people were boarding unsafe planes without knowing the risks. "They're cutting corners," she said. "And someone's going to get killed if this keeps up." There was a long pause. "I'll make the call," Michelle said. Olivia leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. She had started this fight alone. But now she had allies. And she wasn't backing down. Olivia Carter knew the moment she stepped into Skyway Airlines executive offices that they were waiting for her. The air in the hallway felt heavy, the kind of weight that settled in places where difficult conversations happened behind closed doors. The glass walls of the conference room reflected the gray Denver sky outside, streaks of early morning rain sliding down like ink bleeding on paper. She had been summoned to a meeting with Thomas Barrett, the executive director of operations, along with two of the company's legal representatives. No explanation. No agenda. But Olivia didn't need one. They knew. She adjusted the cuffs of her uniform, squared her shoulders, and stepped inside. Barrett sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his expression carefully neutral. The two men flanking him wore suits instead of uniforms, Skyway's legal team, brought in when problems needed to be contained. "Captain Carter," Barrett said smoothly. "Have a seat." Olivia slid into the chair opposite him, keeping her expression steady. "You've been busy," Barrett continued, lacing his fingers together on the table. "Doing my job," she replied. "Your job," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "Your job is to fly planes. Not to dig through maintenance reports, not to question executive decisions, and certainly not to disrupt the efficiency of our operations." Olivia didn't flinch. "My job is also to make sure those planes are safe." Barrett sighed, as if she were a child who didn't understand the rules. "We've received reports that you've been accessing internal documents beyond your clearance level," he said. "You've spoken to employees about company matters outside of your assigned responsibilities. And most concerningly, you've made claims about our maintenance procedures that could be damaging to Skyway Airlines." "Dangerous," Olivia corrected. "Not just damaging, dangerous." Barrett's jaw tightened. One of the lawyers, a man with thinning blonde hair and a practiced smile, leaned forward. "Captain Carter, we understand your concerns, but the way you've gone about this is problematic. The airline industry relies on trust between pilots, maintenance crews, and executives. It would be unfortunate if this issue escalated in a way that impacted your position here." There it was. The warning. The unspoken threat. Olivia sat back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on the arms. "You want me to drop this," she said. "We want you to be reasonable," Barrett said. "If you have concerns, bring them to the proper channels. But this looks like an attempt to stir up unnecessary panic." "Unnecessary?" Olivia let out a quiet laugh. "I've seen the reports. I've talked to your mechanics. You're flying planes with known safety issues. Do you want to know what unnecessary looks like? Unnecessary is the lawsuit that'll come when a family loses someone because of a preventable mechanical failure. Unnecessary is explaining to the FAA why Skyway executives ignored warnings for years. Barrett's face darkened. Be very careful about the accusations you're making, Captain, the blonde-haired lawyer warned. Oh, I am, Olivia said. She reached into her bag, pulling out a folder. Because every one of them is backed by evidence. She placed it on the table. Barrett didn't reach for it. Neither did the lawyers. You should know, Olivia continued, that this folder is one of 3 copies. The second was delivered to an FAA investigator this morning. And the third? She let the words linger before offering a small smile. That one's with a journalist at the Denver Tribune. Barrett's fingers twitched against the table. For the first time, the lawyers exchanged glances. You think this is a game? Barrett asked, his voice low. No, Olivia said. I think this is life and death. And I think you knew that long before I walked into this room. Barrett exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He turned toward the lawyers. Give us the room. The men hesitated, but Barrett gave them a sharp look. Without a word, they rose and left, closing the door behind them. For the first time, it was just the 2 of them. Barrett leaned forward, his elbows on the table. You don't know what you're doing, he said. You think you're the first idealist who's tried to change the system? The first one to think they can fight the machine? Olivia met his gaze. I don't need to fight the machine. I just need to expose it. He shook his head. You think Skyway is the only airline that does this? You think delays don't cost millions? That executives don't have to make hard calls? I think people deserve to get on a plane without wondering if it's going to fall apart midair, Olivia said. Barrett sighed again, but there was something different in his face now. A shift. Like he knew he had lost control of the conversation. You could have had a long career here, he said after a moment. Olivia's lips curved into a humorless smile. I still will. Barrett exhaled, rubbing his temples. What do you want? Ground every aircraft with outstanding safety discrepancies immediately, Olivia said. Conduct a full audit with an independent third party. And issue a formal commitment to employees that retaliation against anyone who cooperated in this investigation won't be tolerated. Barrett let out a dry chuckle. You really think you can force that? You have 1 hour to decide, Olivia said, standing. Barrett looked up at her. And if we don't? Then the FAA gets my full cooperation, the press gets every piece of information I've collected, and your career goes up in flames right alongside this company's reputation. For the first time since she had met him, Thomas Barrett looked genuinely uncertain. Olivia gave him a nod, then walked out. The moment she stepped into the hallway, she felt her breath release in a slow, steady stream. She had done what she came to do. Now, she had to wait and see if they would do the right thing. 1 hour later, Skyway Airlines issued an internal directive grounding all flagged aircraft for immediate safety inspections. By the end of the day, the FAA had launched a formal review, and Skyway's stock had begun its sharp decline. And Olivia Carter? She was just getting started. The news broke just before dawn. Olivia Carter sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of black coffee in her hands, watching the news unfold on the television screen. The Skyway Airlines logo flickered across the banner at the bottom of the broadcast, followed by the words, FAA launches formal investigation into Skyway Airlines safety violations. It was happening. She had known it would. The moment she walked out of Thomas Barrett's office, she had felt the shift in the air. The executives at Skyway had been given an impossible choice, try to bury the truth or face it head-on. And now, with the FAA stepping in and journalists circling like vultures, it was clear which path had been forced upon them. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up, already knowing who it was. You did it, Michelle said, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and admiration. No, Olivia replied, staring at the screen as the news anchor detailed the extent of the investigation. We did it. Michelle let out a small laugh. You always were bad at taking credit. Olivia smiled, shaking her head. But the moment of satisfaction was brief. She knew this wasn't over. This was only the beginning. By mid-morning, the fallout had already begun. Skyway Airlines had been forced to ground more than a third of its fleet for emergency inspections. Flights were canceled nationwide, stranding passengers in airports from New York to Los Angeles. The airline's customer service lines were jammed, and social media was flooded with angry travelers demanding answers. Then, the stock market opened. Olivia watched as Skyway's stock price plummeted. It fell fast and hard, the impact rippling across the financial sector. Investors panicked. Analysts speculated. And inside Skyway's headquarters, executives scrambled to salvage what they could. But some things couldn't be saved. At 2:15 p.m., Thomas Barrett resigned. The announcement was short and sterile, buried in a press release that tried to soften the blow. But the message was clear: Barrett had been pushed out. Olivia sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. One down. Her phone buzzed again. It was Jason Kim. Did you see the news? He asked the moment she answered. I saw, Olivia said. They're in full panic mode over here, he continued. Everyone's walking on eggshells. No one knows who's going to be next. They should be worried, Olivia said. Jason hesitated. Listen, I heard something else. The board is meeting tonight. Word is, they're considering filing for bankruptcy protection. Olivia's fingers tightened around the phone. She had expected them to fight longer, to try harder to cover this up. But this? Are you sure? She asked. Pretty sure, Jason said. A couple of people from finance let it slip. Skyway is hemorrhaging money. Between the stock crash, the lawsuits they know are coming, and the FAA breathing down their necks, they might not survive this. Olivia nodded, even though he couldn't see her. She had spent years fighting to prove she belonged in the cockpit. Months battling the old boys club that had tried to push her out. Weeks gathering evidence that would force them to answer for what they had done. And now, in the span of a single day, the walls of Skyway Airlines were crumbling. She wasn't sure how to feel. She had wanted accountability. She had wanted justice. She hadn't expected to witness the complete destruction of an airline. You okay? Jason asked. I don't know, Olivia admitted. Jason was quiet for a moment. You did the right thing, he said finally. I know, Olivia said. And she did. But it didn't make it any easier to watch. That night, she drove past Skyway's headquarters. The building was still lit, the glow from the windows spilling onto the quiet streets. But there was something different about it now. The people inside weren't planning new routes or expansion strategies. They were trying to stop a ship from sinking. It was too late. The next morning, the headline read, Skyway Airlines files for bankruptcy amid safety scandal. By noon, the Department of Justice had announced an inquiry into potential criminal charges against Skyway executives. The lawsuits had already begun, families coming forward with stories of loved ones who had flown on planes that should have never left the ground. And Olivia? She was no longer just a pilot. She was the whistleblower who had brought down an airline. The world didn't slow down just because an airline collapsed. Planes still took off, passengers still boarded, and the industry continued its relentless march forward. But for Olivia Carter, everything had changed. She wasn't just another pilot anymore. She wasn't just one of the few black women to captain a commercial jet. Now, she was the woman who had taken on Skyway Airlines and won. The morning after the bankruptcy announcement, Olivia sat at her kitchen table, staring at the flood of emails on her laptop screen. There were job offers, 3 different airlines reaching out, eager to bring her on board. There were interview requests from major news outlets, reporters wanting to tell her story. And then there were the messages from other pilots, mechanics, and airline employees from all over the country. Some were words of encouragement. Others were stories of their own, experiences that mirrored what she had faced at Skyway. She closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She had spent her whole life working toward one goal, to fly. Now, for the first time, she wasn't sure what came next. Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Michelle. She answered with a sigh. I'm still thinking. Her sister laughed. I didn't even say anything yet. You didn't have to, Olivia said, smiling despite herself. Well, while you're thinking, Michelle said, there's something you should see. I'm sending it now. A moment later, a link popped up in her messages. Olivia clicked it. It was an article from an aviation trade publication. The headline read, Industry-wide reforms underway following Skyway Airlines collapse. She skimmed the first few paragraphs. It was exactly what she had hoped for, and more. The FAA had announced stricter oversight of maintenance practices across all major carriers. Several airlines had begun internal safety audits to avoid facing the same scrutiny Skyway had. And perhaps most surprising, one of the country's largest airlines had just introduced a new hiring initiative aimed at increasing diversity in the cockpit. They're calling it the Carter effect, Michelle said, her voice warm with pride. Olivia let out a breath, shaking her head. That's ridiculous. Michelle laughed. Maybe. But it's real. Olivia stared at the article, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside her. She had never set out to change the industry. She had just wanted to do her job. To fly. To make sure passengers were safe. To be treated the same as any other pilot. And yet, here it was. Change. Listen, Michelle said, you don't have to make a decision today. But you should know, Atlantic Airways wants to talk to you. Olivia frowned. About what? A leadership role. Safety oversight. She blinked. They want me in management? They want you to help make sure nothing like Skyway happens again, Michelle said. They want you to be the person who makes sure pilots, mechanics, and executives are all playing by the same rules. Olivia ran a hand through her hair. I don't know, Michelle. I know, Michelle said gently. Just think about it. That night, Olivia sat on her balcony, a cool breeze rolling in from the mountains. She watched a plane in the distance, its lights blinking as it disappeared into the night sky. She thought about the first time she had ever been in a cockpit. The way the world had looked from above, endless and open. She had spent her entire career trying to prove she belonged up there. And now, she had the chance to make sure the next generation of pilots wouldn't have to fight the same battles. The next morning, Olivia called Atlantic Airways. She was ready to talk. The world moved on, but Olivia Carter knew that the echoes of what had happened at Skyway Airlines would linger for a long time. It had been nearly 6 months since the collapse of the airline, since the FAA investigation, since the headlines. 6 months since she had walked out of a boardroom full of men who thought they could silence her. She was still flying, though not with Skyway, of course. Atlantic Airways had given her a new home, a place where she could do what she loved without having to constantly prove she deserved to be there. She had accepted a position as a senior captain, but it hadn't stopped there. Not long after she joined, they asked her to help shape their new safety oversight program. To build something better. To make sure that what had happened at Skyway never happened again. She had agreed. Some days, she wondered if she had made the right choice. But then she would step into the cockpit, run her hands over the familiar controls, and remember why she had fought so hard in the first place. She was in the captain's seat for a red-eye flight from Chicago to Los Angeles when her phone buzzed just before takeoff. A message from Michelle. Turn on the news when you land. Olivia frowned but didn't have time to ask questions. She powered down her phone, tucked it away, and focused on the task at hand. By the time she landed at LAX, the airport was just waking up, the sky shifting from deep black to soft gray. She taxied the plane to the gate, went through the shutdown procedures, and debriefed with her crew. It was routine, the kind of steady predictability she had always loved about flying. But as soon as she got to the terminal, she pulled out her phone. She found the first news station she could and watched. Former Skyway Airlines executives indicted on federal charges. She exhaled slowly. The report went on to list the names: Thomas Barrett, Harold Wilson, and 3 others from the upper levels of Skyway management. Charges of fraud, negligence, obstruction of justice. They had tried to cut corners, tried to intimidate employees into silence, tried to put profit over people. And now, they were finally being held accountable. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt relieved. She had done what she could. She had spoken up. She had pushed back. And in the end, the truth had won. Her phone rang. Michelle. "You see it?" her sister asked, skipping a greeting. "I saw," Olivia said. "You okay?" Olivia hesitated. "Yeah, I think so." Michelle let out a small laugh. "That's the most emotion I'm gonna get out of you, huh?" Olivia smiled. "Probably." There was a pause. "I'm proud of you, Liv," Michelle said quietly. Olivia's throat tightened. "Thanks," she said. She ended the call and leaned against the airport window, watching as another plane took off into the early morning sky. She had never set out to be a whistleblower. She had never wanted to be the face of change. She had just wanted to fly. And now, she could. Free and clear, with nothing holding her back. Life has a way of testing us, often when we least expect it. Olivia Carter's story is not just about airplanes or corporate corruption, it's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. It's a reminder that integrity is not always the easiest path, but it is always the right one. In our daily lives, we face choices, some small, some life-changing. There are times when we see something wrong and wonder if speaking up is worth the risk. It could be at work, in our communities, or even within our families. The truth is, silence may be the easier option, but it comes at a cost. Courage is not about being fearless, it's about moving forward despite fear. It's about knowing that doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, defines who we are. For those who have lived long enough, you know this well. The world has changed, but some battles remain the same. Standing for fairness, for safety, for justice, these are timeless values. No matter where you are in life, your voice matters. And sometimes, just one person standing firm is enough to change everything.